So a lot of people are talking about the year of Jubilee. They're talking about it in the context with the rapture of believers. They're talking about it in the context of the end times. There are people who've calculated or attempted to calculate to the best of their abilities. Some of it's pretty impressive when the Jubilee year would be, going back to when the Israelites crossed over into the land of Canaan, adding years and so on and so forth to bring us to what they consider to be the year of Jubilee. And some people, according to their calculations, they've ended up in the year 2025 as being the year of Jubilee. So I want to add my 2 cents to the conversation. So if you want to read about the year of Jubilee, you can go to Leviticus chapter 25. The first thing we kind of need to understand about the Jubilee is the historical context. The year of Jubilee provided an economic and social or societal reset for the nation of Israel. People were released from every kind of bondage. If you're a prisoner, you were set free. If you had been a captive, you were released. If you were a slave, you were no longer a slave. If you had debts, they were forgiven. Land returned back to its original owner. So if you had to sell your family inheritance because of debts that you had, in the year of Jubilee, it would come back to you. In the year of Jubilee, nobody worked. You didn't work the land. The land was to have a rest. And if you had any contracts that were sort of outstanding, you could cancel those without any penalty at all. So there was total rest for the land. There was rest for the people. And there was zero agricultural activity, no planting and no harvesting. So there are people out there who talk about the Great Reset, something, that the people at the WEF want to create. God created the Jubilee to be the original Great Reset for the nation of Israel. So that's the historical context of the year of Jubilee. Secondly, the year of Jubilee has a prophetic implication. It isn't just about land resting and people being set free, physically speaking, from people who have imprisoned them or they've been held captive and so on. There's a prophetic fulfillment of the year of Jubilee as well. It's a prophecy that has application primarily for the nation of Israel. When Christ returns, Israel is going to be released from their bondage to sin. All this rebellion that they've been living in for centuries, they're going to be released from that too. They will never rebel against God ever again. They're going to be reconciled to the Lord, and they will receive forgiveness, and they will receive their land inheritance back again. This will all be returned to them. This is stuff that the beast and the false prophet and all the beings who are setting up that beast kingdom, when they confiscate all of those things, when Christ returns, he is going to restore to the nation of Israel all the things that they've lost physically, as well as restore them spiritually. They're going to receive forgiveness, and they'll receive their land inheritance, and it's both a spiritual and a physical reset. So that's something that I want to really make a point of here, is that the year of Jubilee is a reset, but it's not just physical. It's a physical reset in that actual people and land and money and all of that is going to go back to zero again. But it's also a spiritual reset where the debts that people, and in particular the nation of Israel, the debts they owe to God are going to be forgiven. Okay, their slavery to the enemy, to Satan, and to their own sin, they're going to be delivered from that too. The year of Jubilee is about, physical things, and it's about spiritual things, and it's about resetting everything. So the Jubilee is a reset. And like I said, it's spiritual and it's physical. The Jubilee has prophetic implications, spiritual and physical, for the nation of Israel. Timing. Let's talk about the timing for the Jubilee. It's a year that's actually anchored in time. Again, we would go to Leviticus 25 and read the details about when Jubilee is proclaimed. So historically, in the Word of God, the Israelites were to count 70 Sabbaths of years. Okay, 70 Sabbaths or 7 sevens of years, or 49 years. And then the following year, the 50th year, would be the Jubilee. So the 50th year is inclusive. That means that the year of Jubilee is also year one of the next group of 7 years. Okay, so we don't have a separate 50th year. It's inclusive, and it will be year one of the next group of 7 years. The word Jubilee comes from, I think, the Hebrew word Yuval, which means the trumpet blast or the sound of the trumpet. And it's called that because the trumpet would announce the year of release. It would be blown everywhere in Israel, in all the cities of the whole land, on the Day of Atonement, which was the 10th day of the 7th month. It was one of the fall feast days. Okay, so you have the Feast of Trumpets, you have the Day of Atonement, and then you have the 7-day Feast of Tabernacles with the 8th day at the end. The Feast of Tabernacles was a required pilgrimage feast for the men of Israel. But on the feast day of the Day of Atonement, that one day of the year when the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies and go through this elaborate ritual for the forgiveness of Israel's sins for that year, it was on that day when man could meet with God that the trumpet would sound. Okay, and presumably it would sound after that whole ritual was over and Israel's sins had been forgiven. Then the trumpet would be blown, and they would, the nation would experience not just the physical reset of, going back to the land that they'd lost, or, being forgiven of their debts, or if they were a slave, now going free, but they would also have the spiritual reset of total forgiveness between them and God. So the Jubilee would be announced on the 10th day of the 7th month, on the Day of Atonement, which was one of the fall feast days if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. The Day of Atonement was the day when the Israelites were declared clean and forgiven before God, and the Day of Atonement was the spiritual reset for the nation of Israel. So Jubilee is all about a reset, okay, whether it's physical, economic, societal, or spiritual. Number 4, Jubilee is connected with the agricultural year of Israel. So in Israel, the agricultural year actually starts in the fall and directly after the fall feast days. So after that final feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, the 8th day, people would go home, okay? And in a normal year, they would go home and immediately they would start planting the barley and wheat that they would harvest the following spring. So the rainy season for Israel is in the winter. They would go home and plant in late fall, plant their crops. The rains would come. They're called the early rains. And then the spring rains, the latter rains, and then the harvest would be brought in. The harvest of barley would come out first, and that was what was offered during the Passover time. Now, the men would come up, and their families too would come to the Feast of Tabernacles. And like I said, in a normal year, everybody would go home and they start right in working because you have to get those crops in the field. Now, if you're going home on a year that's going to be the sabbatical year, the 7th year out of every cycle when the land is just supposed to rest, then people would theoretically just go home and take a break. They wouldn't work during the winter, they wouldn't work in the spring, they wouldn't sow, they wouldn't reap. Every 7th year, they would go home and have a rest, and also on the 50th year. So there'd be the 7th year, which is like the 49th year, and then the 50th year, which would be the year of Jubilee, would start the next Sabbath cycle, the next 7-year cycle. And there would be 2 years in a row when people would let the land rest, and then in the 50th year, they would have a year of Jubilee, which meant that, everything got reset again. And because it was declared on the Day of Atonement, there's also this spiritual reset component of the year of Jubilee. Now, the only Jubilee cycle that has been spelled out for us real clearly, that has application for the end times, is the sabbatical cycle, a Jubilee cycle that we read about in Daniel chapter 9. This is the one that actually has application for the end times. This is the prophecy commonly known as the 70 weeks of Daniel. So most prophecy teachers will tell you that the 70th week of Daniel, the 7-year-long period of time, is the final prophetic week that is in the prophecy of Daniel 9. What most of them won't tell you, or what they don't know or don't want to admit or whatever, is that we're talking about, agricultural cycles. We're talking about the Jubilee cycle. We're talking about every 7 years letting the land rest. And that's always starts in the fall with the trumpet sounding on the Day of Atonement. And then people would go home and not plant anything because they weren't going to be reaping anything the following year. There was a guy, Sir Robert Anderson, back in the late 1800s, who wrote a book called The Coming Prince. And he did some calculations, and he used what he thought was the correct Jewish calendar of 360-day years, and he did a bunch of mathematical whatevers from the date when the decree was issued, that we read about in Daniel chapter 9, issued by Artaxerxes Longimanus, the decree that was issued by him in the spring. And he did not understand about the sabbatical cycles, not Artaxerxes, but Sir Robert Anderson. He didn't read this the way a Jewish person would read it. And he just read that there would be 70 groups of 7 years, or 490 years, from the time the decree was issued. So he figured the decree is issued in the spring, we'll add 490 years or 483 years, leave that 70th week for the end times. And when you do that, you end up using this complicated math of the 360-day Jewish spiritual year, or whatever you want to call it, and ended up on the triumphal entry, that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on the exact day that he calculated these groups of 7 years. Okay, and I've done videos on this before, specifically on Sir Robert Anderson's calculations, and how, though he was a good man and he had a good heart and he loved Jesus, he was not aware or didn't understand what was going on here. Okay, that we weren't talking about just starting the count at whatever time the decree was issued, but we're counting groups of sabbatical years, that there would be 70 groups of sabbatical years, right? And these years always begin in the fall. They always begin in the fall. They never begin any other time, because they're connected to the agricultural year. And how do I know that? I know that because of the reason why the Jews were in Babylon to begin with. Okay, so you'll remember this. The Jews had 70 years in Babylon. Why 70? What's so magic about the number 70? The number 70 was arrived at because the Jews did not keep the Sabbath year, okay, every 7th year. They didn't let the land rest. Well, how long, how many years didn't they let the land rest? Well, they didn't let the land rest for 70 groups of 7 years, or 490 years. So for 490 years before they went to Babylon, the Jews didn't keep that Sabbath year, okay? For 70 years, that the land did not get its rest. Okay? 490 years is 70 weeks of 7 years equals 490. Then they were taken into Babylon, okay? And they were going to be there for 70 years. And then Daniel starts praying. He realized that what he'd read in Jeremiah the prophet said that they would be in captivity for 70 years. Okay, and then Daniel starts praying, and he's asking God about this. When are we going to go back? Forgive our sins. Help us to be the right kind of people that we need to be. This is that great prayer in Daniel chapter 9. And the angel Gabriel comes and says, hey, there's going to be another group of 490 years, 70 groups of 7 years. And these are the same kind of years as over here. In other words, these are sabbatical years that have to do with the land resting. And the land rests start in the fall, which means that if you're going to let the land rest, you don't immediately go back after the Feast of Tabernacles and plant and plow and plant and do all that stuff. It means you go home and you just let it go. You don't do anything. So this is what we're talking about here. We're talking about two bookends, two periods of 490 years each. But it's at the end of this group right here that the spiritual reset would happen. Okay, the spiritual reset, because we're talking jubilees and we're talking sabbatical years. Let's talk about the spiritual reset in the context of Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9, verse 24 tells us the reason for all of this, the 70 weeks of years. Okay, we got a problem over here. Israel is in rebellion. Then they were sent into Babylon. And then what Gabriel told Daniel was, this rebellion right here, by the end of another 490 years or 70 groups of 7 years, this rebellion is going to be over. No more. No more rebellion. And by the way, this is how we know that the 70th week of Daniel hasn't happened yet. This is how we know that it's not historical. And that is because at the end of the 70th week, Israel's rebellion is supposed to be cured forever. Forever. They are never supposed to rebel again. Let's read the promise that was given to Daniel concerning the nation of Israel, especially Judah and Jerusalem. Let's read what it says in Daniel 9:24. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. Okay, so this prophecy concerns the Jews and it concerns Jerusalem. And this is what's going to happen by the end of the 70 weeks. To finish transgression, no more of this rebellion. To make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness. Okay, everlasting righteousness for these people, for the Jews, for the rebellion of the Jews. Everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Okay, so what we have are 70 groups of years. Artaxerxes issued the decree. Then the Jews went back, and it took them 7 years to rebuild the city and so on and so forth. That's one group of 49 years, and the following year would be a jubilee. Okay, and then at the end of 483 years, that would be when Messiah would arrive at the end of the 7 plus 62 weeks. I've talked about all that in other videos, so I'm not going to go over that here. But there is one portion that's left of that 70-week prophecy, and that would be the final week. If you're pre-tribulation or you believe in most popular eschatology that have a 7-year tribulation or 7 years at the end, then that 70th week is still up for grabs. I think Jesus fulfilled the first 3.5 years of the 70th week. He put an end to sacrifice and offering, full stop. And then there's a break in time, and then upon the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. That's the Antichrist. And then he will set up his Antichrist kingdom for 3.5 years, and then Christ will return. And that will finish out the 70th week. And because we're dealing with sabbatical years that start in the fall and end in the fall, Jesus is going to return on the Day of Atonement. Now, I want you to listen to the language from Daniel chapter 9. This is Day of Atonement language. To finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity. This is what the Day of Atonement is all about, right? For Israel. It's about canceling out rebellion and bringing in forgiveness and reconciliation with God. Now, we know that when Jesus died on the cross as the sacrifice for sin, and he put all the whole Mosaic system to rest on the day that he died, we know that Christ made a way for people, for everybody to be reconciled to him. The Jews in the first century, they were not terribly thrilled with who Jesus was as a person, so they delivered him up to be crucified. After his resurrection, after his ascension, of course, many, many Jews did believe in Jesus, including priests and Pharisees and high-level people. They believed in Jesus, but by and large, the nation itself rejected him. So when Christ returns, even though Israel has been in rebellion, like total and complete rebellion against God for centuries, his work on the cross, the forgiveness of sins, this declaration that the nation is forgiven and is reconciled to him, that is going to happen on a future Day of Atonement, which is going to usher in the 10th and final Jubilee that's prophesied in the 70 weeks of years. So the 70 weeks actually begins that final group of 7 years. And then at the end of the 70th week, we have the Jubilee. The Jubilee will be proclaimed on the Day of Atonement, the day that Christ returns. This is very clear from the scriptures. This is very clear. The Jubilee year starts on the Day of Atonement, and that is when it's proclaimed then, and that's when it begins. It does not begin in the spring. It doesn't begin, with Jesus' triumphal entry and all of that. That's a very Gentile way of viewing the scriptures. A Jewish person would understand 70 weeks of years to be sabbatical years, which begin in the fall, and they're connected to Israel's agricultural year. Let's read Zechariah 12:10. This is a prophecy of Christ's return. And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps for a firstborn. Okay, this crying out for mercy, this contrition, this kind of mourning, this is all stuff that is associated with the Day of Atonement. And when Christ returns, he is going to apply, let me see if I can find the verse for that. Zechariah 13:1, on that day there shall be a fountain opened for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and uncleanness. Okay, all of that has Day of Atonement imagery associated with it. Anybody who is trying to calculate the end times based on the, going through the calculations from when the first Jubilees and the years and counting this, that, and the other thing up until this present day, all of that is very interesting. But you have to understand that the Jubilee is at the second coming of Christ. That's when the Jubilee year will be. Do we know when the second coming of Christ will be? Well, as far as I can see, the nearest it would be in 2029. And that's if believers are raptured this fall. Okay, so the only way we'll know for sure when the year of Jubilee takes place is when Christ returns, and that will be basically in retrospect. Once we're there, we'll know, this is the year of Jubilee. But what people want to know is, okay, so as I'm going forward into my future, can I calculate when the year of Jubilee will be? I don't think so. I don't think that's possible. And the reason I say that is because we don't have clean calendars and such, and if you're trying to do calculations that are like hundreds and thousands of years ago, you're not going to end up on the right day. It just kind of can't happen. You can have some good guesstimates, but even then, we've been given a very clear revelation in Daniel 9 about when the Jubilee will be. Okay, we already know. Okay, we know it's at the end of the 70th week. That's when it'll take place. And we know that the 70 weeks of years are dealing with sabbatical years, which always begin at the beginning of the agricultural year, which is in the fall, not in the spring. Okay, so that's where people get a little messed up in their thinking. So I think this is the reason why God has given us the book of Revelation, and he has given us a couple of signs that we can look at and understand where we're at in the big picture. And why people ignore the book of Revelation the way they do, I have no idea. Why our focus hasn't been on the book of Revelation and decoding it, I will never know, especially since the Revelation 12 sign happened in 2017, and it was this astronomical alignment that perfectly matches what we read in Revelation 12, verses 1 and 2. And that was the first sign. The second sign is coming. It's the sign of the dragon. And I have done a number of videos on the sign of the dragon, which will be something we can see. We will know when we're there. And the rapture of the male child will occur as part of the sign of the dragon. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I have some videos I'll leave links to in the description box below. But I hope this has helped you understand the purpose for the Jubilee is not just to have a societal and an economic reset. It's about a spiritual reset. And the ultimate spiritual reset will be when Christ returns and declares Israel freed from their sins, and that there will be no more rebellion. And do you realize that during the millennium, Israel will never forsake the Lord? The nation of Israel will be the last group of people standing at the end of the millennium when Satan is released. And the Bible tells us that Satan and Gog will gather the nations from the four corners of the earth, and they are going to march on the beautiful city. That's Jerusalem, the capital. That's the capital of Israel. The whole world will march on Israel. And then fire will come down from heaven and destroy all those people. And then Israel will actually be brought into that position of sonship in the eternal kingdom. They will sit before God in his presence with God's name on their foreheads, and they will worship him forever. And that's when believers will actually move on to the next phase of our inheritance, which is as the bride of Christ. Done videos on all of those things. So I hope you'll check out the description box, the timelines, the links to videos. There's so much information, Bible studies, all kinds of things. Also Discord, you can join my Discord server, a little outpost of heaven. We'd love to have you. This is a place where you can just talk about end times to your heart's content with people who like talking about that stuff too. So let me know what you think, and we'll see you on another video. Till then, have a blessed day.